I never thought moving into a quiet suburban neighborhood would end with a gun pointed at my wife's chest. Yet there we were standing at our own front gate when a black SUV screeched to a halt, headlights blinding us. Out jumped a man in a cheap tactical vest with the words HOA security plastered across the front. His hand went straight to the pistol on his hip, barking orders like we were criminals trespassing on our own land. Neighbors peeked from behind their blinds, whispering, waiting for a spectacle. My heart was pounding, but my wife, she didn't flinch. Her face stayed calm, her eyes locked on his shaking hand. He had no idea who he was threatening. To him, she was just another homeowner, just another target to intimidate. But the truth, he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Before we dive into the full story, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? We hadn't even finished unloading the moving truck when I realized something was off about this place. You know how most neighborhoods greet you with a smile, a wave, maybe a welcome basket of stale cookies? Well, not here. Here, our welcome party came in the form of a black SUV with tinted windows and a set of floodlights so bright I thought I'd accidentally stumbled into a police raid. The SUV rolled up slow, crunching over the gravel like a predator circling its prey. Painted across the side in bold, blocky letters were the words HOA security. And let me be clear, this wasn't your average neighborhood watch in reflective vests and flashlights. No, these guys had gone all in on the tough guy aesthetic. The driver's window rolled down and out leaned a man who looked like he'd been rejected from both the police academy and the local biker gang. Shaved head, dark sunglasses, even though the sun was setting, and a jawline that screamed, "I buy protein powder in bulk." "You can't park that here," he barked, gesturing toward our moving truck, which was idling harmlessly by the curb in front of our brand new house. He blinked. "Excuse me." He pulled himself out of the SUV boots, hitting the pavement with a theatrical thud. He adjusted the Velcro on his tactical vest, yes, a full tactical vest, like he was about to storm Fallujah, and tapped a clipboard tucked under his arm. "Violation, blocking street access. Emergency vehicles can't get through." I glanced behind me. The street was wide enough to land a small plane, and the only traffic was a kid on a scooter 2 blocks away. "You're kidding me," I said, half laughing, half waiting for the prank cameras to pop out from the hedges. But my wife wasn't laughing. She stood beside me, arms crossed, eyes narrowing in that way she does when she's sizing someone up. If you've ever seen a lioness study her prey, you'd know the look. Calm, patient, dangerous. "Sir," she said evenly, "we're moving in. The truck will be gone in an hour." The guard sneered. "Doesn't matter. Rules are rules." He pulled a pad from his clipboard and started scribbling furiously as though he was issuing us a ticket for felony murder rather than parking by our own home. I felt my blood pressure spiking. "Look, buddy, we just got here. We haven't even unpacked the dishes yet. Maybe you could give us a little grace period." He looked up from his clipboard, smirked, and said the line that sent my stomach into knots: "There's no grace period. This neighborhood runs on compliance." That was the first time I realized what we were dealing with. This wasn't a homeowners association, it was a regime. The SUV idled menacingly, another guard inside, tapping the wheel like he was itching to get out and join the fun. A few neighbors lingered across the street, whispering and pointing. Their faces told the whole story. Some pitied us, some were entertained, and a few looked downright relieved that it wasn't their turn under the spotlight. My wife, however, hadn't moved an inch. She just stared at the man like she was memorizing every detail, his stance, his tone, the way his hand twitched near his belt. If I didn't know better, I'd have thought she was profiling him the way a professional does. The guard ripped the slip of paper from his clipboard and shoved it toward me. "Fine. First of many if you don't learn how things work around here." I snatched it from his hand and read the bold print at the top: HOA notice of violation, $150. "For parking a moving truck," I muttered. "You've got to be kidding." "Not a joke," he said flatly. "This neighborhood takes security seriously." I wanted to tell him what a joke he actually was, how ridiculous his getup looked, how his authority was about as legitimate as a mall cop's badge at closing time, but something about the way his partner revved the SUV's engine told me now wasn't the time. Instead, I stuffed the fine into my pocket, forcing a smile that was about as convincing as a cardboard cutout. "Welcome to the neighborhood, huh?" I muttered to my wife. She didn't laugh. She didn't even crack a smile. She just whispered so low only I could hear, "Stay calm. They're watching for a reaction." Her voice was steady practice, like she'd been in situations far worse than this, and that should have been my first clue. The guards finally pulled away, tires crunching down the street, leaving behind an eerie silence. I thought the confrontation was over. Silly me, that was just the opening act. Because later that night, long after we'd carried the last box inside, I heard the same SUV roll past our house again. Slow, headlights cutting across our windows. I peeked through the blinds, and sure enough, the shaved-head guard was in the passenger seat clipboard, glowing under the dashboard light. He was writing something. He was writing about us. And in that moment, standing there in the dark, I realized this wasn't going to be some neighborly misunderstanding we could laugh about over barbecue. No, this was war. And what the guard didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my wife was the last person in the world you should ever try to intimidate. The next morning, I thought maybe things would calm down. Maybe that first run-in with the so-called security goons was just a bad welcome, and the rest of the neighborhood would turn out to be halfway normal. That hope lasted all of 15 minutes. I had just poured my first cup of coffee when a sharp knock rattled the front door. 3 deliberate bangs like a debt collector come to repossess the furniture. My wife was upstairs unpacking, so I set the mug down and opened the door, expecting maybe a neighbor with a tray of muffins. Instead, I got her. A woman in her 50s stood there in a crimson blazer, heels planted firmly on the welcome mat like she owned it. Perfectly styled blonde bob, sharp lipstick, and a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She thrust out a manicured hand. "Good morning. I'm Deborah Morgan, president of the Pine Hollow Homeowners Association. Welcome to our community." I shook her hand, though. It felt more like shaking the cold grip of a loan shark. "Thanks," I said, trying to sound polite. "We're still settling in." Her eyes flicked past me, scanning the half-unpacked boxes stacked in the hallway, the moving blankets, even the faint trail of dirt from our shoes on the hardwood floor. She had the gaze of someone who'd memorized the bylaws like scripture and was already tallying violations in her head. "Well," she said brightly, "I'm afraid we need to discuss your first notice." "Excuse me." She reached into a leather portfolio and pulled out the very same violation slip her goon had handed me the night before. Only now it was neatly laminated and stapled to a printed letter. "Failure to comply with parking regulations," she read. "Blocking emergency access. The fine remains at $150 payable within 10 days. I stared at her. "You seriously laminated it?" "Documentation is important," she replied, as if she were explaining gravity to a child. Behind her, the same black SUV idled at the curb. Shaved-head security guy leaned against the hood, arms crossed, sunglasses reflecting the morning Sunday. Another guard stood by the driver's side, tapping a baton against his leg in a slow rhythm. This wasn't a visit, this was a show of force. "Look," I said, keeping my voice level, "we just moved in. The truck was gone last night. Nobody was blocked. Can't we just let this go?" Her smile tightened. "Oh no. If we let one rule slide, the whole community collapses. People start leaving their trash cans out. Grass grows half an inch too long. Suddenly property values plummet. Do you want that on your conscience, Mr. Taylor?" I blinked at her. "Lady, it's a driveway, not the fall of the Roman Empire." That earned me a sharp intake of breath. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I expect full compliance. Everyone here does. The HOA is the backbone of Pine Hollow, and I am its head. You will respect that." Before I could respond, my wife came down the stairs. She walked to the door calm as ever and gave Deborah a polite nod. "Good morning. Something wrong?" Deborah's smile returned, but it was brittle. "Your husband seems to think the rules don't apply to him." My wife arched an eyebrow. "That's so." Deborah thrust the laminated violation toward her like it was a royal decree. "Non-compliance will not be tolerated." Now here's where things got interesting. Most people would have argued, maybe slammed the door, maybe written a nasty email. Not my wife. She simply took the violation slip, studied it for a long moment, then folded it once and set it gently on the porch railing. "We'll review it," she said calmly. "Thank you for stopping by." Deborah's face flushed red. "Review it. There's nothing to review. You either pay the fine or you don't. And if you don't..." Her words were cut off by the sound of the SUV's engine revving. Security guy tapped his watch, like he had all day to play this intimidation game. My wife didn't flinch. She just looked Deborah straight in the eye and said, "We'll handle it. You can go now." It was the kind of tone that brooked no argument, firm, steady, commanding. For a split second, I saw Deborah hesitate, like she just realized she wasn't dealing with your average suburban pushover. But then she plastered on her fake smile again. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." She spun on her heel, marched back to the SUV, and slid into the passenger seat. The guards climbed in after her, and the vehicle rolled slowly down the street, turning heads at every house it passed. When they were gone, I turned to my wife. "What was that? You didn't even argue." She shrugged. "Arguing gives them power. Better to let them think they've won for now." I frowned. "For now? What do you mean for now?" She just gave me that look again, the one that said, "Trust me." I've handled worse. And that was when it hit me, she wasn't just keeping the peace. She was strategizing. Later that day, as I tried to unpack the kitchen, I noticed her standing by the front window watching the street. The SUV cruised by twice in an hour, slow and deliberate. Each time she tracked it with her eyes not fearfully but like a soldier assessing the battlefield. It sent a chill through me because suddenly I realized this wasn't going to be a small neighborhood spat. This was the opening salvo in a war we hadn't asked for. And Deborah Morgan, with her laminated notices and fake smile, had no idea the woman she was trying to bully was trained to stare down real threats. Compared to the people my wife had dealt with in her career, this HOA president and her toy soldiers were nothing more than noisy children playing dress-up. But still, noisy children with guns can get dangerous. And I had a gnawing feeling things were about to get a whole lot worse. If I thought that ridiculous welcome from Deborah and her tactical Barbie dolls was the end of it, I was dead wrong. That laminated fine was just the opening shot in what turned into a full-blown campaign of harassment. By the third day in Pine Hollow, we already had 3 separate violation notices taped to our door. One for grass height variance, which was hilarious because we hadn't even mowed yet. One for trash receptacle visibility, even though the bins were still empty in the garage. And one, my personal favorite, for unsightly moving boxes visible from window. I mean, really, we'd been there less than a week. Did they expect me to teleport my furniture into place? Each notice came with its own neat little fine attached, $50 here, $75 there, creeping up like compound interest. I joked to my wife that maybe the HOA had hired a Las Vegas casino consultant because they were treating violations like slot machines. You pull the lever and out pops another fee. But the funny part stopped being funny around nightfall. The first time I heard the SUV crawl past our house at midnight, I brushed it off. Maybe they were just overzealous about security. But then came the second pass, and the third. By the time 2 a.m. rolled around, I was standing at the upstairs window watching those headlights sweep across our walls like searchlights in a prison yard. And it wasn't just drive-bys. At one point, they stopped right in front of our driveway. I saw the shaved head guard get out shine a high-powered flashlight right at our bedroom window, then scribble something on his clipboard. My wife didn't even blink. She pulled the curtains shut, turned off the lamp, and went straight back to bed like she'd seen it all before. Me, I lay awake, adrenaline buzzing, imagining headlines like "Local man shot over grass height violation." The next morning, another notice was stuck to the mailbox. This one accused us of excessive lighting visible from street. I had to laugh. They'd shined their floodlight into our window, then cited us for too much light. It was so absurd, it circled back to terrifying. I started venting to neighbors whenever I got the chance, but that only earned me nervous glances and tight-lipped smiles. One older gentleman muttered, "Keep your head down. Don't stir them up." Then he shuffled off like he'd just handed me state secrets. It was like living in a neighborhood under occupation. Everyone knew the rules were insane, but nobody dared challenge the regime. Except my wife. She went about her day unfazed. She unpacked boxes, tended to the little patch of flowers near the porch, even waved cheerfully to passing cars like nothing was wrong. But I noticed the way she watched the guards out of the corner of her eye, the way her shoulders squared when the SUV slowed in front of the house. It wasn't fear, it was calculation. One night, after yet another round of flashlight harassment, I finally snapped. "This is insane," I hissed, pacing the living room. "We should call the police. File a report. Something." She looked up from the stack of papers she was sorting through. Calm, steady, not a flicker of panic. "And tell them what? That the HOA is driving past our house too many times, that they taped a notice on our door. The police won't care. They'll say it's civil, not criminal." I threw my hands up. "So what, we just let them bully us until we fold?" Her eyes met mine, sharp and unwavering. "We don't fold. We wait. They'll push harder. And when they cross the line, we'll be ready." I shivered, not from fear, but from the way she said it. "We'll be ready." Like she was already 10 moves ahead playing chess while the rest of us were stuck at checkers. The next escalation came at the so-called community patrol. It was Saturday evening. We just sat down to dinner when the SUV rolled up again, this time with flashing amber lights mounted on top, strobing like a knockoff police cruiser. 3 guards got out, all in matching black uniforms with HOA security stitched across their chests in white block letters. They marched up our driveway in formation like they were about to breach the door. I stepped out onto the porch before they could knock. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Clipboard guy cleared his throat. "Routine inspection." "Inspection of what?" He didn't answer. He just pointed to the small American flag hanging near our garage. "Unapproved flag display. Against HOA Code, Section 1-2. I nearly choked. It's the United States flag. What code are you talking about? He scribbled something. Code Section 1-2. Unauthorized displays disrupt visual harmony. Fine is $100. I laughed, loud and bitter. Visual harmony. Are you kidding me? But he didn't laugh. None of them did. They just stared stone-faced, like I was the unreasonable one. Then my wife stepped out behind me. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She just said, "You've made your note. You can leave now." And something in the way she said it, low, firm, almost commanding, made them hesitate. Clipboard guy shifted his weight, glanced at the others, then finally turned back down the driveway. They left without another word, the SUV rolling off into the night. I stood there stunned. "How did you do that?" I asked her once we were back inside. She shrugged, almost smiling. "It's all about tone. Authority recognizes authority." It was the first time I suspected there was a whole lot more to my wife's past than she'd ever told me. And it was becoming clear that the HOA wasn't going to stop. They'd keep pushing, piling on fake violations, circling our home like vultures. What they didn't know was that they were poking a sleeping lion. And when she woke up, God help them. By the time the letter came, I was already on edge. It was printed on heavy cardstock, embossed with the HOA seal like it was an invitation to a royal banquet. In reality, it was a summons mandatory attendance. HOA General Assembly. Known attendance subject to fine. A fine for not attending a meeting. These people were creative, I'll give them that. Saturday evening, we walked down to the community clubhouse, which looked less like a friendly gathering place and more like a courthouse designed by someone obsessed with beige paint and fluorescent lighting. As we entered, I could feel every eye in the room snap toward us. Dozens of neighbors sat stiffly in folding chairs, clutching binders of HOA rules like hymnals. At the front, Deborah Morgan stood at a podium, crimson blazer, blazing under the cheap overhead lights, flanked on either side by her two security officers. It wasn't a meeting. It was a trial. Order, Deborah barked into the microphone, though nobody had spoken. Tonight we address serious non-compliance from one of our newest residents. Her eyes locked onto us like a hawk spotting a mouse. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some neighbors leaned forward eagerly, others shrank into their seats, clearly grateful the spotlight wasn't on them. Deborah gestured grandly. "Mr. and Mrs. Taylor, stand please." I exchanged a glance with my wife. Her face was unreadable. I stood my chair, scraping loudly against the linoleum. My wife rose beside me, calm, poised as though she were stepping onto a stage she knew better than anyone else. Multiple violations in less than 2 weeks, Deborah continued flipping through laminated sheets like they were evidence in a murder trial. Improper parking, unauthorized lighting, grass length above acceptable standard, unapproved flag display. And she held up one paper, dramatically unsightly moving boxes visible from window. "Do you deny these charges?" Charges. She actually said charges like we were defendants in court. I opened my mouth ready to unleash a sarcastic tirade, but my wife's hand on my arm stopped me. She stepped forward slightly, her voice calm, steady. "These are not charges. They're arbitrary complaints." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Deborah's face twitched, but she recovered quickly. "Arbitrary. These are the rules. Everyone here complies, or they face the consequences." The security guards shifted behind her, crossing their arms in unison. They looked more like nightclub bouncers than protectors of suburban peace. "Rules exist for fairness," my wife said evenly, her eyes never leaving Deborah's. "But fairness without reason is tyranny, and tyranny has no place in a neighborhood." I swear if a pin had dropped, we all would have heard it. The neighbors' eyes darted back and forth as if waiting to see who would win this duel. Deborah's smile stretched tight, her voice sharpening. "This is not a debate, Mrs. Taylor. This is about compliance. Your family has shown a flagrant disregard for our standards. That cannot continue." She snapped her fingers and clipboard guy stepped forward, slapping another notice onto the podium. Effective immediately, the Taylors are on probationary status. One more violation, and the HOA will pursue legal action, including liens on your property. That got the crowd buzzing. A lien meant financial ruin, foreclosure. Deborah was swinging a sledgehammer just to prove she could. My temper flared, but before I could speak, my wife took another step forward. Her posture didn't change, but her voice dropped steady and deliberate. "Threats don't scare me. You're hiding behind clipboards and fines because you're afraid of losing control. But bullies always overreach, and when you do," she let the words hang, "you'll regret it." The room went dead silent. Deborah's face flushed crimson to match her blazer. One of the guards jabbed a finger toward my wife. "Careful, lady. You don't talk to the president like that." That was it, the moment the whole room felt the tension snap like a wire pulled too tight. The guard's tone wasn't just rude, it was a threat. Neighbors gasped. A woman in the back clutched her husband's arm. Another man whispered, "They've gone too far." Deborah slammed her hand on the podium. "Enough. This meeting is adjourned. The Taylors are warned. One more violation, and we take action." The security guards stepped closer, clearly trying to intimidate us. My wife didn't flinch. She simply turned, took my arm, and guided me toward the door as though she were dismissing them. As we walked out, I glanced back. The neighbors were still staring, some with fear, others with admiration. And I realized something important in that moment. We weren't just fighting for ourselves anymore. We were becoming the test case, the proof of whether anyone could stand up to Deborah and her pet stormtroopers. Outside, the cool night air hit my face like a splash of water. I exhaled hard, adrenaline buzzing through my veins. "I can't believe you said that in there," I muttered. She gave me that small, knowing smile. They needed to hear it, and they needed to see that intimidation doesn't work on everyone. I shook my head, half in awe, half in fear. "You just painted a target on our backs." Her eyes flashed calm but unyielding. "Good. Now let's see what they do next." And with that, she walked ahead of me into the night, her silhouette sharp against the streetlights. I knew deep down that something bigger was coming. The HOA wasn't going to let this stand. They'd push harder, escalate further. And when they finally crossed the line, God help them. Because my wife wasn't the kind of person you threatened lightly. It started out like any other morning, quiet, almost deceptively normal. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and for the first time in days I thought maybe, just maybe, things would settle down. My wife was out front tending to her little flower bed near the gate, still unpacking the life we had barely moved in. I was inside sipping coffee, convincing myself that the storm had passed. Then I heard the sound. A deep growl of an engine-heavy tires crunching gravel. My stomach dropped before I even looked. Through the front window, I saw the black SUV screech to a stop right outside our gate. The words, HOA, security, glared across the side like a warning sign. 2 men climbed out. One was clipboard guy, already holding his pad like a weapon. The other shaved head, dark glasses, tactical vest, so tight it looked like he was auditioning for a bad action movie, strode toward the gate with his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. I bolted out the front door, my heart pounding. "Hey, what now?" The shaved head guard sneered. "Violation. Unauthorized planting." I blinked. Planting. "She's putting flowers in the ground. Flowers. Against HOA landscaping code," he barked. "Non-approved flora disrupt neighborhood aesthetics." I almost laughed, almost. But then he did it. He yanked his pistol out of its holster and pointed it straight at my wife. Time stopped. The morning birdsong cut to silence. My coffee mug slipped from my hand, shattering on the porch, but I barely heard it. All I could see was that weapon leveled at the woman I loved. "Step away from the flowers," he shouted, voice cracking just enough to betray his nerves. "Hands where I can see them." My wife didn't flinch. She didn't scream, didn't even blink. She simply straightened, brushed the dirt off her gloves, and looked him dead in the eye. Her calmness made the scene all the more surreal. "Are you insane?" I roared, rushing forward. Clipboard guy blocked me with an outstretched arm. "Back up, sir. For your safety." For my safety. The irony would have been funny if a gun wasn't aimed at my wife's chest. Neighbors were spilling out onto porches now. Blinds snapped open, faces pressed to glass. People whispered, gasped, some even recorded on their phones. The entire block had become our audience. The guard's hand trembled on the trigger. He was sweating, but his voice tried to stay tough. "This is a direct order. Violation will be enforced." My wife finally spoke. Calm, steady, deadly serious. "You don't want to do this." He snarled. "Lady," I said, but she cut him off. "Put the gun down." Her tone didn't rise, didn't waver, but it carried more weight than a shout ever could. It was the voice of someone who had given that order before, someone who knew exactly how this would end if he didn't comply. The guard faltered just for a moment. His sunglasses slid slightly down his nose, revealing eyes wide with sudden uncertainty. Clipboard guy leaned in. "Don't let her rattle you, she's bluffing." I could feel my throat closing, fear and rage twisting together. I wanted to scream, to throw myself between them, but something about the way my wife stood calm, immovable, like a pillar of steel, made me freeze. She took one slow step forward. "You're out of your depth. You don't understand who you're dealing with." The guard's grip loosened. His hand shook harder now. The barrel wavered just enough for the crowd to notice. A murmur rippled through the neighbors watching. Phones lifted higher, recording everything. And that was when Deborah herself appeared. The HOA president stormed up the sidewalk blazer, immaculate face twisted with fury. "What is going on here?" she shrieked. "Do your job, enforce the rules." Deborah, my wife, said evenly, her eyes never leaving the trembling barrel, pointed at her chest. "Call him off." "Now," Deborah sneered. "You don't give orders here. I do." The absurdity of it all hit me like a wave. Here we were in a quiet suburban neighborhood where the greatest conflict should have been over whose turn it was to host book club. And instead, a man with a gun was threatening my wife over flowers. The crowd buzzed, louder, nervous energy building like a storm. Someone shouted, "This is too far," another neighbor yelled. "She's unarmed." And still my wife didn't move, didn't flinch. She simply said with terrifying calm, "You've just crossed the line." In that frozen moment, I realized this wasn't the first time she'd faced a gun. She wasn't just a homeowner. She wasn't just my wife. She was something more, someone trained, prepared, dangerous in a way these HOA clowns couldn't begin to imagine. I didn't know the full story yet, but I was about to find out. For a split second, I thought the world had stopped spinning. My wife stood in the middle of our front yard, a pistol aimed squarely at her chest, and yet she didn't so much as twitch. I could hear my own heartbeat, hammering in my ears. The neighbors' whispers turned into frantic chatter. Somebody muttered, "Call the cops," but nobody moved. Then my wife did something that nearly made me forget how to breathe. She smiled. It wasn't a nervous smile or a forced one. It was the kind of calm, confident smile a chess master gives when their opponent doesn't realize they're already checkmated. "Son," she said to the guard, her voice low but sharp enough to slice the tension in half, "you've got about 5 seconds to lower that weapon before your life takes a turn you won't recover from." The guard blinked, thrown off by the sheer authority in her tone. His hand trembled harder, the muzzle of the gun wobbling in the air. "Don't test me," he growled, though the quiver in his voice betrayed him. My wife took another step forward, deliberate and unflinching. Her hands were still at her sides, calm, controlled. Then she slowly reached into her jacket pocket. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Some thought she was about to pull a weapon of her own. The guard stiffened his finger, twitching dangerously near the trigger. But instead of a gun, she pulled out a worn leather wallet. She flipped it open in one fluid motion, holding it high for everyone to see. The sun glinted off the badge inside. Secret Service. The air was sucked out of the block all at once. A chorus of gasps rippled through the neighbors, followed by dead silence. Even Deborah froze, her eyes wide as saucers. "Drop." The weapon, my wife repeated louder, this time her voice ringing with the kind of authority you don't fake. "Now." The guard's composure shattered like glass. His arm dropped the pistol dangling uselessly from his fingers before it clattered to the pavement. His face went pale as the reality hit him. He hadn't been intimidating some suburban housewife. He'd just aimed a firearm at a federal agent. Clipboard guy staggered back, his precious violation pad slipping from his hands. "What the hell, she's bluffing, right?" he stammered to Deborah. But Deborah wasn't answering. Her lips moved soundlessly, her perfect smile gone, replaced with a look of pure horror. My wife stepped closer, tucking the badge back into her jacket with the same casualness you'd use after showing someone your driver's license. "I've taken down men twice your size and twice as reckless," she said evenly, staring the guard down. "If you think HOA bylaws give you authority to threaten me with a gun, you're about to learn the difference between pretend power and real power." The neighbors were no longer whispering, they were openly talking now. Some were cheering, others were recording every second. A man shouted, "You tell him from across the street," another yelled. Finally, someone stood up to them. The guard dropped to his knees, hands raised. His voice cracked. I didn't know." "That's the point," my wife snapped. "You never know who you're messing with, and you should never, ever pull a gun unless you're ready to face the consequences." For once, I was completely speechless. I had always known my wife was strong, calm under pressure, but seeing her like this commanding, unstoppable, radiating authority that made armed men fold like paper, it shook me to my core. Deborah finally found her voice, though it came out as a shrill squeak. This isn't necessary. It's just a misunderstanding." My wife whirled on her eyes blazing. "A misunderstanding? Your so-called security aimed a loaded gun at me on my property over flowers. That's not a misunderstanding. That's assault with a deadly weapon." Deborah faltered, the color draining from her face. I didn't tell him to." "Save it," my wife cut her off. "You put him here. You gave him the authority. That makes you responsible." Neighbors clapped, some even whistled. The crowd had shifted, no longer silent, no longer cowed. They were rallying, finally seeing the HOA for what it was, a petty dictatorship built on fear. The guard scrambled backward, dropping his holster as if it burned. Clipboard guy muttered something about needing a lawyer and stumbled toward the SUV. Deborah, however, was rooted to the spot, humiliated in front of the very people she claimed to control. And my wife. She didn't gloat. She didn't shout. She simply straightened her jacket, turned to the crowd and said, "This ends today. These men are not law enforcement. They have no right to threaten you. And if they've done this to me, I guarantee they've done it to others." The crowd erupted, neighbors nodding, shouting their own stories of intimidation. One man yelled, "They fined me $500 for having Christmas lights up too long." Another shouted, "They threatened to tow my car while my wife was giving birth." It was as if a dam had broken. The fear that had kept everyone silent was gone, washed away by the sight of one woman standing firm. And for the first time since we'd moved into Pine Hollow, I saw something I hadn't seen in my neighbor's eyes before. Hope. The flashing blue and red lights came sooner than I expected. One of the neighbors must have called 911 the moment the gun came out, because within minutes the quiet cul-de-sac was awash in sirens. 2 police cruisers skidded to a halt at the corner doors, flying open. Officers spilled out weapons drawn, shouting commands. "Hands where we can see them. Everyone stay back." The crowd of neighbors scattered across lawns, clutching their phones, some ducking behind fences for cover. Clipboard guy dropped flat on his stomach like a pancake, arms outstretched in surrender. The shaved-head guard still knelt where he'd been shaking so badly I thought he might rattle apart. Deborah stood stiff at the curb, her face pale, but her chin held high, as if she could bluff her way out of what had just happened. But the real showstopper wasn't the police. It was my wife. She stepped forward, calm as if she were strolling into a boardroom. Her hand dipped into her jacket again, and I swear I felt my soul leave my body when I saw her pull the leather wallet back out. She flipped it open, held it high, and her voice carried over the chaos like a whip crack. "United States Secret Service. Stand down. I've got this." The officers froze, exchanging quick glances. The sergeant in charge stepped forward cautiously, eyes darting between the trembling guard, the crowd, and my wife. "Ma'am, identify yourself." She rattled off her name, rank, and clearance with the ease of reciting a grocery list. The sergeant's face changed instantly, from skepticism to recognition, then to the sharp professionalism of someone who knew he was standing in the presence of the real deal. He holstered his weapon and barked orders at his men. "Secure the suspect. Take his weapon. Get statements from the witnesses." Just like that, the scene flipped. Officers swarmed the shaved-head guard, yanking his pistol away and cuffing him on the spot. Clipboard guy wailed about just following orders as he was hauled up by his armpits. Deborah protested loudly, "This is outrageous. This is private security. You have no jurisdiction." The sergeant turned on her dead cold. "Ma'am, these men brandished a firearm on federal property. That gives us all the jurisdiction we need." I had to stifle a laugh at that. Federal property, he meant our yard. But the way he said it, with my wife standing tall beside him, made it sound like the whole block belonged to her authority. The neighbors crowded closer again, no longer afraid. They shouted their grievances at the officers, each story more damning than the last. They fined me for leaving my bike outside. They threatened to tow my car during a funeral. They barged onto my property without permission. It was like years of bottled-up frustration spilling all at once. Deborah tried to shout them down, but the wave of voices drowned her out. Her face crumpled, the perfect mask, breaking into raw panic. My wife raised a hand, and the crowd quieted as if she were the actual mayor of Pine Hollow. Her voice was measured, but it carried weight. These men acted under the authority of this homeowners association. They were unlicensed, armed, and threatening residents. That is not neighborhood safety. That is criminal intimidation. The sergeant nodded. "We'll need full statements, and we'll be contacting the county prosecutor." Deborah gasped. "Prosecutor, you can't. This is an internal matter." "No, ma'am," the sergeant shot back. "Pulling a gun on someone is not an internal matter. That's a felony." The guard, still cuffed on the curb, finally broke down. "She told us to do it," he blurted, jerking his head toward Deborah. "She said keep them in line, said we could use force if we had to." The crowd roared in outrage. Deborah stammered, waving her hands, but the words stumbled out like broken glass. That's not what he misunderstood. But no one was buying it anymore. The officers guided her aside, peppering her with questions. My wife stepped toward them, calm and unyielding, offering her own detailed account. I watched in awe as she spoke, professional, precise, her posture radiating command. She wasn't just part of the scene, she was running it. When the chaos finally settled, the guards were in custody, Deborah was pale and trembling, and the neighbors were buzzing with a new kind of energy. Not fear this time, relief. Vindication. One woman clutched her phone like a lifeline, eyes wide. I recorded everything she said, showing my wife the screen. "It's all here, they can't deny it." My wife gave her a small nod. Good. Hold on to that. The truth matters. As the cruisers pulled away with the guards in the back seats, a strange quiet fell over the block. Deborah slumped into her car, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. She peeled out of the neighborhood blazer, crumpled dignity, shredded. I turned to my wife, still trying to process everything. So, Secret Service, huh? She finally smiled, faint but real. I told you I'd handled worse. I shook my head, a laugh bubbling up despite the insanity of it all. I thought you meant angry neighbors, not wannabe mercenaries. Her eyes scanned the street, still sharp, still on alert. Angry neighbors are one thing, but tyrants with clipboards and guns, they needed to be stopped. The crowd clapped, some cheered. For the first time, Pine Hollow felt less like a prison and more like a neighborhood again. But deep down I knew this wasn't the end. Deborah wasn't the type to accept humiliation quietly. No, she'd lick her wounds, regroup, and come back swinging. And when she did, she wouldn't just be facing us. She'd be facing a community that had finally found its voice. The following week felt like living inside a slow-motion implosion. Everything Deborah Morgan had built, the facade of control, the fake aura of authority, crumbled piece by piece right in front of the very neighbors she had lorded over for years. It started with the news vans. By Tuesday morning, the cul-de-sac was jammed with satellite trucks and reporters wielding microphones like bayonets. Somebody's shaky cell phone video of the gun incident had gone viral online, millions of views overnight. The headline was brutal: HOA security pulls gun on woman over flowers. If that wasn't enough, the second clip, my wife flashing her Secret Service badge and commanding the guard to disarm, had become a meme. I saw one version on Twitter with the caption, "When Karen's HOA thinks they're in charge, but your wife is literally the government." Deborah tried to get ahead of it. She called a press conference on the steps of the clubhouse, dressed in a fresh crimson blazer, smiling like nothing had happened. "The Pine Hollow Homeowners Association values safety above all," she declared, voice sugary sweet. This was a minor misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by social media. She didn't make it past the third sentence before neighbors started shouting her down. "Minor misunderstanding, he had a gun. You told him to do it. You've been harassing us for years." The cameras captured every word. Deborah's smile cracked under the pressure, her eyes darting wildly as the crowd turned against her. She tried to continue, but the chant started, "Resign, resign, resign." By Thursday, lawyers were circling. A group of residents, many of whom had stayed silent for years, banded together and filed a class action lawsuit against the HOA for harassment, intimidation, and misuse of funds. My wife helped them organize the paperwork, guiding them with a calm precision that left everyone else stunned. She wasn't just exposing the corruption, she was dismantling it one clause at a time. Deborah's allies vanished overnight. The same neighbors who once smiled nervously and nodded at her rules now crossed the street to avoid her. Her beloved security team was gone, still sitting in county lockup, facing charges for assault with a deadly weapon and impersonating law enforcement. Without them, Deborah looked smaller, diminished, just another woman clutching a clipboard that no longer meant anything. I'll never forget the look on her face at the emergency HOA board meeting. The board members, once her loyal soldiers, sat stiffly at the long table, avoiding her eyes. The room was packed with residents buzzing with energy, no longer afraid. My wife and I stood in the back watching. Deborah slammed her palm on the table. "This is a witch hunt. You're letting outsiders dictate how we run our community." One of the board members, a meek man with thinning hair, cleared his throat. "Deborah, she's not an outsider. She lives here. And frankly, she's done more to protect us in 1 week than you've done in 10 years. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Deborah's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Another board member spoke up. "We've reviewed the accounts. Tens of thousands of dollars in security fees. No licenses, no permits, just cash withdrawals." He slid a stack of papers across the table. "Care to explain where the money went?" Deborah's hands shook as she gathered the papers, flipping through them with jerky motions. That's confidential. HOA business." "No," the man interrupted, his voice firmer now. "That's embezzlement." The word hit the room like a thunderclap. The neighbors erupted again, shouts, boos, people demanding her removal. My wife didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She just stood there, arms folded, watching Deborah's empire collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. By Friday, Deborah was gone. Packed her things in the dead-of-night car, loaded to the brim, and drove out of Pine Hollow without so much as a goodbye. Word spread that she'd hired a lawyer, but the lawsuit was already in motion. The county had opened an investigation. Her once iron grip on the neighborhood was now reduced to gossip, whispered over fences. And Pine Hollow, it felt different. Lighter. Kids played in the street again without security harassing them. Neighbors actually waved at each other, real smiles this time. Someone even organized a block barbecue, the first in years, apparently. The tension that had hung like a storm cloud over every house was gone. At the barbecue, people kept approaching us, thanking my wife, thanking me. One man even raised a toast to the Taylors for proving we didn't have to live in fear anymore. I glanced at my wife, who lifted her glass, but stayed modest, her expression unreadable. She didn't bask in the attention. She never did. But I could see the faintest trace of pride in her eyes. Not for herself, but for the fact that people were finally free. That night, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I let out a long sigh. Well, I said, I think it's safe to say the HOA won't be bothering us anymore. My wife chuckled softly, a rare sound. For now? I looked at her. For now, you think they'll try something else? She didn't answer right away. Her gaze lingered on the street where kids rode bikes under the fading light. Finally, she said, bullies don't stop until someone forces them to. We forced Deborah out. But there will always be another one somewhere. The trick is knowing how to handle them. I leaned back in my chair, shaking my head in amazement. You make it sound so simple. She smiled, faintly, eyes still on the horizon. That's because at Island. Stand firm, don't let fear win. The rest takes care of itself. And for the first time since we'd moved into Pine Hollow, I actually believed her. The neighborhood never looked the same after Deborah vanished. For weeks, Pine Hollow was buzzing like a beehive that had just been cracked open. Without the constant patrols, without Deborah's clipboard, decrees people rediscovered what it meant to live without fear of fines taped to their doors. Lawns grew half an inch too long, and nobody cared. Kids left bikes on sidewalks, and no one threatened to tow them. The silence of intimidation was gone, replaced with the sounds of laughter and normal life. I found myself walking the streets more often just to take it in. Every house looked a little brighter, every wave from a neighbor a little more genuine. Some even stopped me to apologize for staying quiet so long, for letting Deborah run unchecked. I didn't blame them. Fear has a way of tying knots around your voice until you forget how to speak. But what stuck with me most wasn't the neighbor's newfound courage, it was my wife. I'd always known she was strong, steady. But seeing her stand in front of a gun without flinching, watching her dismantle Deborah's entire empire with a single flash of her badge, it made me realize just how little I truly knew. For years I thought her calmness was just patience. Turns out it was discipline honed in ways I could barely imagine. We sat on the porch one evening, sipping iced tea, watching kids chalk hopscotch squares on the pavement. I couldn't help but laugh. All this I said over flowers. Can you believe it? She smiled softly. It was never about flowers, or parking, or boxes in the window. It was about power. People like Deborah think fear makes them strong. They forget that fear only works until someone stands up. I tilted my head. And you knew how to stand up. Her eyes met mine, steady as always. Because I've faced real threats. These people, they were just pretending. And pretend power always crumbles under the real thing. It hit me then Deborah had been running a neighborhood like a fiefdom, but in the end all it took was one person refusing to bow. Not with shouting, not with violence, but with calm, unwavering authority. The lawsuit against the HOA dragged on, but honestly by that point it hardly mattered. The community had already changed. Residents met weekly not to gripe about grass or paint colors, but to plan actual improvements, fixing sidewalks, organizing block parties, even starting a community garden. For the first time, Pine Hollow felt like what it should have been all along, a neighborhood, not a battlefield. As for Deborah, rumors trickled back. Some said she moved 2 towns over, tried to join another HOA board, only to be laughed out of the room when someone pulled up the viral video. Others claimed she was hiding out, waiting for things to die down. But honestly, she was irrelevant. Her power had evaporated the moment my wife told that guard to drop his weapon. One night as we locked up the house, I turned to my wife. You know, I said most people would have panicked that day. I still don't know how you kept so calm. She gave me that same knowing look. Because fear doesn't solve anything. Action does. Then after a pause, she added, and because I knew he was bluffing. I laughed. Bluffing, he had a loaded gun. Her smile was faint, but her eyes sparkled. And no conviction behind it. You can always tell. I shook my head in awe. I'd never stopped being amazed by her. So that's how our dream move into Pine Hollow turned into the wildest chapter of our lives. We came looking for peace and quiet and instead uncovered an HOA drunk on fake authority. They thought they could intimidate us into compliance. But they didn't know my wife still carried the authority of the United States government in her back pocket. They tried to play cops. She was the real deal. And that made all the difference. Looking back, this whole saga taught me more than I ever expected about life, fear, and courage. Because here's the truth. Bullies exist everywhere. Sometimes they wear suits and sit on HOA boards. Sometimes they throw on tactical vests and pretend they're law enforcement. And sometimes they're just the loudest voice in the room. Their power doesn't come from being right. It comes from people being too afraid to stand against them. But fear is fragile. The moment one person, just one, refuses to bend, everything changes. My wife didn't scream. She didn't fight back with fists. She stood calm, steady, and exposed their authority for what it was, paper thin. And once everyone else saw it, they realized they didn't have to be afraid anymore either. That's the lesson I want you to take from this. No matter where you are, whether it's an HOA gone wild, a toxic boss, or someone trying to push you down, remember that their power only works if you give it to them. Sometimes all it takes is standing firm, keeping calm, and saying enough. So tell me in the comments, have you ever faced a situation where someone tried to intimidate you only to find out they weren't nearly as powerful as they pretended to be? I'd love to hear your stories. And if you enjoyed this wild ride through Pine Hollow, hit that subscribe button. There are plenty more HOA nightmares and victories still to come.